Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. We're up to Unit 4 today, so welcome, and Friday before the weekend. And so welcome to Rob and Alex and Steve. I'm just giving you the opportunity, if you want to say anything during the course of the presentation, then I've given you the option to do that. So all you've got to do is unmute yourself at your end, and you certainly are more than welcome to make a comment, ask a question, whatever might suit you. So welcome. I'll share my screen so you can see the slides that I will be covering today. And I'm just going to make that full screen. Oops. Okay. All right. So we're obviously going to talk about the visioning and purpose conversation to improve engagement. Now, I think this is a very important conversation and one that's often missing. I think we do know from surveys that something in the order of 40 to 50% of people actually don't know what the strategic direction of the organisation is. And I don't mean by that they haven't memorised the plaque on the wall. It's really that they don't know how their work actually does meet the requirements of the organisation. They can't connect the dots between what they do day to day and the actual overall strategic direction. So it's very important that we have these conversations with people and not make the assumption that people actually know what the organisation's attempting to do, because that would be dangerous and often erroneous. So we've got to be careful with that. All right, so that's the topic today. And if we go back, and you might recall that 2 weeks ago, we talked about the GROW model, and I actually did a coaching session with you. You might recall I asked you a number of questions. What we found was that your level of optimism, you might recall, went up. So it's quite interesting that here am I, probably many miles away or many kilometers away from wherever you are. I couldn't see you, and I asked you several questions, and we had an overwhelming response where people's optimism went up just by using this GROW model. So I guess what I was trying to do is to convince you of the value of it. So I think it's a great model, and it's certainly well worth considering in your own workplace. So today we're going to look, as I said, on the visioning and purpose conversation, and then we've got 2 more conversations to look at: the encouraging conversation and the relationship building conversation, which we will cover in the next month or so. So I want to talk about the management of distraction to start with, and this is a very important topic in the 21st century because most of us are bombarded with information left, right and centre. Unless we're on the desert island, we're getting bombarded with all sorts of information. And the problem with that is that often we get distracted by that information, and that of course takes us off on a tangent that we're perhaps not best served going down. And I'm thinking of social media and all sorts of things like that. So it's critically important that we manage that distraction, and that's got huge implications for the visioning conversation. So I'm going to share with you some tools around how you might actually be able to have that conversation with your team members. And then I'm going to talk about a team values charter, which is an excellent system or framework that I put together in one of my previous books, The New Influencing Toolkit. All right, so away we go. And at any time you feel that you want to say something, then please feel free to do that. I would welcome you to do that. So what I want to do now is talk about the fact that time management is not the problem. In fact, it's interesting that we have all these courses called time management, but in actual fact, it's not time we're managing, because time marches on whether we like it or not. True enough. So it's not the time we have to manage, it's ourselves we have to manage. And so we really probably should be calling these courses personal management. But of course, if you did that, it was very confronting, and maybe some people may not want to go. So it's a sort of a way of keeping our attention away from that. But at the end of the day, it's distraction management that's the problem. It's our ability to focus on the key things that are important. And that's not just the people that you lead, it's also you as well. So our job is to manage ourselves in those circumstances as such. So What I think we should do, and what we ought to do there is we need to have these conversations with people around what's important and what isn't. Because there's a colleague of mine in the United States called Brent Peterson, who wrote a magnificent book many years ago called Fake Work. Of course, we know about fake news, but well before that, Brent talked about fake work. And his argument was that 40% of everything we do in organizations is fake. And what I mean by fake, or what he means by fake, is that these are mindless meetings we attend, or emails that are not relevant to our strategic direction. All these sorts of things get in the way of us achieving what we are there to achieve. Now, he argued that if it's 40%, and I'm not sure how he measured it, but if he says that 40% of everything we say, think, and do is fake work, then his argument is, imagine if you could get it down to 35%. That's a 5% difference. What a difference that would make organisationally. And it would make a significant difference exponentially across the organisation. He argues that, because he's from America, he argues that the United States would not have a problem in terms of its own levels of productivity if they could reduce their fake work from 40% to 35%. So it's an interesting argument, isn't it? Nevertheless, that's the whole purpose of having this visioning conversation, is so that how we can actually manage distraction. Let's take that a little step further. So Warren Bennis was actually the management consultant that came up with the notion of management of distraction. And he talked about this from the point of view of, he said the biggest challenge of the 21st century is the management of distraction. I think he's absolutely right, and I think he's proving to be right. And he said that it's one of the 4 core key competencies that 90 of the top business and public sector leaders in the United States identified, is this ability to make sure that distractions don't get in the way of what we do. So investing intentional attention where it matters leads to effective communication that results in productive action. So really, your job and my job as leaders is to make sure that we can reduce as much of this fake work as we can by giving people some clarity around what their priorities are and what's important and what isn't. And most of us have got all these balls juggling in the air at once, as we know. And the point is that in those, juggling all these balls, it's inevitable that we won't be able to achieve them all. So we're never going to have enough time to do everything, but we will always have enough time to do the important things. So the question then becomes, what's important? And I'm sure all of you have seen examples where some of your team members are working on things that really have no relevance whatsoever to the strategic direction of the organisation. So the vehicle for rectifying that, of course, is the visioning and purpose conversation. So let's talk a little bit further about that. Simon Sinek, in his great book, The Why of Work, actually argues that if you look at work, there are 3 dimensions of work. There's the what, the how, and the why. What Sinek was talking about the what, is what you actually do, which is the tasks and activities that people do day to day. These things, of course, are in the job description. These things are very apparent, usually to someone that's on top of their job. The how, of course, is how you go about it. This is, of course, the methodologies, the processes and procedures we use in order to get things done. That's the how. So in some senses, in the how, the visioning conversation might have some impact. But right in the center, Simon Sinek talks about the why. The why is, why do we do what we do? What's the purpose? So he talks about this, and he talks about the need to be on purpose and why we need to be very focused on what we do. And I think he's absolutely right. And no wonder the book became an international bestseller. So where the visioning and purpose conversation comes in is the why. We can assume, of course, that people know what has to be done, and we probably know how to do it if we've got a job. The question is, do we know why we're doing it? And why might that be important? Well, it's important for lots of reasons. So let me give you a very practical example to start with. Let's assume that it's late at night and in a production environment, somebody's about ready to go home, the shift's just finished, it's late at night, people are tired, and one of the managers comes down to the production area and says to one of the people in the production area, I'd like you to sweep the floor before you leave. Now, the person, of course, if if he said nothing else, then the person, of course, is probably going to be a little bit disgruntled about that, assuming they didn't have to do that normally. But if the manager said to them that the reason I want you to do this is that we've got a new potential new client coming in tomorrow who wants to look over the plant and have a look at how we do things, they're thinking very much of bringing their business our way. But they just want to make sure that, you know, everything's working according to what they think in our production area. And I just want to create the right impression. And in order to create the right impression, I just want you to sweep the floor so that we can do that. Now, it's not likely that the person who's tired at the end of a shift is likely to get all excited about that. Of course, they still want to go home. But at least they've got a context. At least they've got an understanding of why. And so it's not just the managers barking out a direction or whatever. They've got some clarity around the why. And that is exactly the reason for having that conversation with the person. And I think I'd challenge you to think about lots of things in your workplace where you could perhaps explain the why or have a conversation with people about the why. Because it's surprising how little, as I said at the outset, that people can connect, how surprising it is that people really can't connect the dots between what they're doing day to day and the overall direction. I kind of think about it a little bit like a forest. You know, some of your team members are in a forest, but they've got their head pressed up against a very large tree trunk. And because their head's pressed up right against the tree trunk, they can't actually see that they're in a forest. In other words, unless they stood back from the tree, they wouldn't appreciate the fact that there are other trees, in fact, lots of trees, hundreds, if not thousands of trees in the forest. They can't see it. And I think that's true, that analogy, for lots and lots of people in the workplace. So they're working closely on something, but they don't understand the big picture. Now, for a manager to be able to get that particular person to appreciate that they're in a forest, it would require them to step that person back from the tree at some point, so they could actually look around and survey and realise that they're part of a forest. Now, that is exactly what the conversation, the visioning conversation is all about. Now, why is that important? Because then the person puts some context and meaning around why they're doing what they're doing, and they have a little bit of better understanding of how important their role is in the full circle of events that go on in your workplace. Now, people often take their work for granted and have no clue whatsoever about its importance and how it impacts on other things. So, for example, if somebody in your team is to write reports, accurate reports, and those reports need to be available to other departments in your organisation, they may not see the value in that from the point of view of other parts of the organisation that require that information. So if that person is actually sloppy in the report writing, or inaccurate, or late in getting that information to another department, it may impact significantly that department's ability to do their job. And sometimes people aren't aware of that until the manager actually has that conversation with their team members. So this is the reason why the visioning conversation is so crucial. So here are some questions that you can ask. And these questions address the following. I mean, these aren't questions you'd necessarily ask the other person, but these are the questions that need to be addressed if you're having a really good visioning conversation with one of your team members. Why is the work that they do important? Now, if you can't answer that, then clearly there's a very good chance that the person doing the job won't be able to answer that either. So your job is to really give them an opportunity to understand why what they're doing is important. Now, it probably is far more important than they give credit for it. So what's not important in terms of the work that they do? So, I mean, as I said, 40% of the work we do is fake. So there's lots of things that we do day to day that actually don't make a huge amount of difference to the strategic direction of the business. So being able to discuss what's important and what's not important with your team members gives people some sense of focus on what they need to do. So for example, if one of your team members had 11 projects on the go at once, which isn't unusual, then clearly they're going to have an issue around what priority these projects should occur in. Now, unless they come to you, of course, they might try and have a guess at which is the most important. They might take a deadline-driven approach to that, which is the normal course of action, but the deadline approach may not be a good way of going about it. And so a conversation with that person, if you got the opportunity, would be very much around priorities around these 11 projects. What's important right now? What has to be done? Which of these things can be put on the back burner? These would be questions that you would discuss with the team member. You would also talk about what's changed in the workplace, or in terms of the, beyond your workplace, in terms of the customer requirements, other departments, other stakeholders that might rely on your team, addressing those issues. All of those things would be important. All of those things, I should say, need to be communicated to the team member. Where are we heading? So are you clear where you need to head in terms of your team or whatever you're managing? Are you absolutely crystal clear about that? It might well be that you need to have a visioning conversation with your boss so you can get some clarity around where you're heading, and maybe they need to have a visioning conversation with their boss, and maybe it's never ending. But if you're not clear about where you're going, then obviously people in your team are certainly not going to be clear. So it might well involve you having visioning conversations with your manager rather than your team members. So that might be something to think about as well. So what do I need to do now and in the future? So is there some clarity around that from your team point of view? What do I need to do now and in the future? All right, so I'll just pause there for a moment. And are there any questions that any of you have got? I mean, you can use the chat box if you like, or just unmute yourself and sing out. And I'm here, so you'll just have to unmute yourself, and you just do that, of course, by clicking on the mute microphone down there in the bottom left-hand corner. So anything at all at this stage that people would like me to address, or are there any examples in your own workplace where priorities can be a little skew-if and it does require you to enter into this visioning conversation? Steve, what about yourself? Is there anything there that you wanted to raise? No, all good. Okay, so let's keep moving on then. So if I go back to my slides, and so there are some of the core issues and questions that you might like to answer in this whole notion of this visioning conversation. Of course, the big thing that people do with these visioning conversations, or one of the reasons that the visioning conversation is not as forthcoming as it should be in the workplace, in my experience, is very simply because the manager makes the false assumption that their team members know what's important and what isn't. So the manager's making an assumption that the employee can work out for themselves what is important and what's not. This is a very dangerous and often misleading assumption. And of course, if you ask people the closed questions, such as, are you clear what you need to be working on? You're more than likely going to get a yes. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean yes, that they are clear about it. They're just saying that because they want to get you off their back, and maybe they actually do think they're clear, when in actual fact, they're not clear at all. So Simon Sinek reminds us in his book, Starting With Why, which is a great read, by the way. I strongly recommend the book for you. It doesn't matter what you do, it matters why you do it. This is a really interesting quote from the book. So it's all about priorities. Actually, life is all about priorities. The trouble, of course, in the world of work is that these priorities will shift and change and chop and churn at a fairly quick pace. So what might be a high priority today may not be a high priority tomorrow, or vice versa. And so what that means, of course, is that we've got to be very, very flexible and nimble about how we deal with things. And that requires you to have these conversations with individuals. It also means that in terms of your team, when you get them together for the obligatory meeting once a week, you probably need to also reset priorities around what are critically important over the next course of the next week. So what actually needs to be done, what has to be accomplished. And so you're communicating at both the individual and the team level. And don't underestimate that. And as I said, if you're a little bit confused about priorities, then you can be sure that your team will be doubly confused. And so your job is to go and get the information you can from your manager and hound them until you get the right answer. And of course, you're having that visioning conversation upward rather than downward. Come back to the team and let them know. So you might say, well, I'm not sure which of these things is most important, which is the most important project right now. I'll check with my manager. I'll come back to you this afternoon, and I'll be able to hopefully give you an answer, and we can go from there. All right. Now, here's something that, I've talked about this. This is the sweeping the floor in the production area that I spoke about earlier when I talked about the need to pretty much work out, give people a rationale. So when you give people routine tasks, this is where it can become dangerous. If you give someone a special project, then obviously it's clearer why that special project has to be done, I would assume. However, when you give someone a mundane job to do, or what might be perceived as a routine job, they may not value the reason for that. So a lot of things that have to be done may have a very strong rationale behind them, but the team member doesn't know. And it's up to you as the leader to give them the rationale for that, to explain it to them. And so don't think this is all about giving people special projects. It is actually much more than that. It could well be that it's the routine work that gets you undone in this regard. So I think it's true to say that, from my experience working across 21 industries, I think it's true to say that there are two basic reasons why leaders don't indulge in communicating purpose to their team members as much as they could. I think one reason is it takes time. And what I mean by that, of course, is that, if you sit down with people and explain to them the vision or what we're trying to achieve, that sucks up what's probably possibly very valuable time that can be spent somewhere else in the business. So I think it's a time issue. In other words, it's not so much a time issue, it's probably that the leader may not think that it's really worthwhile doing that. So they decide to do something else, and they ignore or neglect the communicating the purpose to a team member. So I think that's a very real reason why people don't do it. I think the second reason, as I've said before, is that I think the assumption that the leader is making is that the employee already gets it. And this is a very dangerous and misleading assumption. As I said before, surveys show that almost 50% of people have no clue where the strategic direction of the company is leading. And so therefore, if they're not clear about that, if half your team or half the organization isn't clear about where they're going, then clearly there's a need to have more visioning conversations in your organization. I think these are the two big reasons that people avoid this conversation or don't do it anywhere near enough. Now, the other, maybe there's a third reason as well, is that people feel that, you know, they'll be sort of stating the obvious and they might be seen to be a little condescending if they're explaining to people the vision and the reason for it. But I don't necessarily think that's the case. And I gave the example about sweeping the production area. And I think that, you know, when you're sitting down with people and maybe they've written a report or something, it's riddled with mistakes. And you're obviously explaining to them that these mistakes are just not, you know, they don't meet your expectations. Well, that's fine. But I think what you've got to recognize too is that why are you doing that? I mean, is it just your personal standard that you don't expect mistakes to be made? But you might then go a little further and say, look, there are other people that are reading these reports and they're getting valuable information from those reports to help them make their own decisions, for example, and then you explain that. And so therefore, if we can present our reports without mistakes, then it's obviously creating one less distraction for people, and they can get on and, you know, use the information in your report for the right reasons. I'm sure you'd appreciate that, you see. So even something like that can be couched in terms of the actual vision and what we require. So I think I think the two main reasons are definitely it takes extra time I could be spending doing something else, and maybe they already understand it, so why would I bother going there? When people are asked to do a job that's commonplace, that's commonplace, it shows some dignity to them to explain the worth of the work that needs doing. Sorry, there's a few mistakes in that there. So it's actually dignified to give people a reason or a why that you want the job done by such and such a time, or you want the job done in a certain way. It's actually showing respect to the other person to give them that explanation. Otherwise, you know, they may just see it as another one of these 11 things I've got to do, and maybe it's not as fun as the other things that I have to do. So maybe I'll leave it off the list, or maybe I'll leave it last. And then, of course, you get very upset with them later because you feel that they've committed to doing it, but in actual fact, they haven't. And I've talked about this previously by asking people for their commitment to get the job done. So that would be problematic without a doubt. So don't go there with that one. So I think there are three questions that need to be considered in the visioning questions that you may want to consider. Why does this job, task, project make a difference? Now, you know, whatever the person might be doing, regardless of how mundane or whatever it might be, quite frankly, they wouldn't have a job if it was a waste of time. You wouldn't have thought. So in other words, there's some difference it makes. I don't know what that difference is. You've got to connect the dots with that, but that is definitely something that's worth communicating to the person doing the job. And not assume, of course, they know that. Why is the team member's contribution important? Do they know? I think a lot of people undervalue the work they do in the workplace, and they just go through the motions because they think that what they do is not all that important. It makes no difference. So I'm not necessarily going to put much into it. And why is it important to do it right and be accountable? Because obviously it's not, you just don't want people going through the motions and doing the job. You actually want them to be accountable for the work that they do. So that's important as well. You know, what are they accountable to you for? So that becomes critically important. So that's the key thing. So why does the job make a difference? Why is the team member's contribution important? and what is important, why is it important to do it right and be accountable. All right, so hopefully that gives you some sense of the sort of questions that might be, that you need to address, if you like, in this whole process. Now, one of the most powerful forms of visioning statements, visioning conversations, is to use storytelling. Now, don't cringe. People say, "Oh, I'm no good at telling stories." Honestly, we tell stories all day, but stories are a very powerful and frequently ignored communication tool for sharing vision. Now, let me tell you a story just to show you how powerful this is. I was mentoring a young consultant, and this consultant had just come out of university and wet behind the ears. They weren't, they had to go off and get their client base. They didn't have a lot of experience, so therefore it's going to be a tough journey for them to do that. And one of the fundamental lessons that I wanted to teach this mentee was the need to do their homework and find out what the customer wanted. Before you go and see a client, you need to understand the business. You need to understand a little bit about some of the issues that are going on in the business so that you can talk as a problem solver. Now, you and I'm sure, would both understand that. But I could have given this mentee a lecture on that. I could have explained that, the why, but I decided not to do that. I thought, no, that'll just go in one ear and out the other. So what I said to this mentee is I told them a true story, and I'll tell you the story too, because it's true and it's painful for me, and you'll appreciate it shortly, but it left an indelible impression on the other person, and this is how it went. In the days when I was young, when I was a consultant, one of the key things that we were required to do, because I was working for a consulting firm, well-known consulting firm, one of the things we had to do was to book up as many appointments as we could during the week. And the law of averages, the old idea is if you've got, many, many meetings booked and you sat down and had those meetings, inevitably through law of averages, you'd get some consulting work out of it. So that was the rationale. So it required you cold calling, you get the meeting, and then of course off you'd go to the meetings. Well, of course, I got a meeting one day. I've got many meetings, but I got this one meeting I'll never forget as long as I live. Anyway, I turned up to the business, and it was a sort of a manufacturing production type business. I won't mention its name. Anyway, I got a meeting with the CEO of that business, and anyway, I was ushered into the boardroom by his PA. And I was seated at the big, impressive mahogany desk. And I'm sitting there patiently waiting, of course, for the CEO to arrive for the meeting. He was running a little bit late. So I opened up my notebook and I was all ready to go with my spiel and all the things that you would do. Anyway, the CEO comes in through a door from his office and we shake hands and we sit down, and then the CEO, before I could even launch into asking him some questions, said to me, I'll never forget it as long as I live. He said, "You don't know anything about our business, do you? You don't know the problems we're going through. You haven't done any due diligence on any of the issues." Now, if you want to know the truth, I didn't know anything about the business. Of course, I knew what they manufactured, but I had no idea about their problems because in those days, well, there was no internet, but the point is, in those days, their whole idea was to book up the meetings and go to them. So I clearly couldn't bluff my way through. I couldn't all of a sudden sort of, talk about things and problems in that business without knowing. I didn't know. So I had to admit to that CEO, and I did. And I said, look, I must admit, I don't know a lot of the issues that you're going through. And before I could finish what I was saying, he said, well, you're wasting my time. I'm a busy person. I've got lots of things that I've got to do. And you came and booked a meeting with me, and you did not have the courtesy to find out what our issues were, what our challenges were, and you just wasted all my time. Now you can imagine I just wanted to shrink under the table at this point. It wasn't a good feeling. I tried to salvage it. I said to him, look, if I go and do my homework and come back, would you be prepared to meet with me again? And he sort of grunted, and it wasn't a convincing yes. I'd actually lost the potential and credibility to have another meeting with him, truth be known. And so I lost the ability to turn that prospect into a client. Now, I shared that story with my young mentee, and you can imagine that story would have had much, much more effect than if I had just sat there and said, look, rule number one, make sure you do your homework before you go and see the client, which probably would have gone straight over the top. So you can see that storytelling is very effective. It's particularly effective when you tell stories in the negative about past experiences you've had. They become even more powerful learning opportunities because people can feel the pain of the mistake that you've made, just as you could no doubt feel the pain of what I had to go through in that boardroom when I was confronted by that CEO. So storytelling's great, and you don't have to be terribly articulate. You just tell it as it is. Now, I'm going to share with you the concept of the team values charter, which I started out. And as you can see on your page there, it comes from one of my books, The New Influencing Toolkit. So the team values charter is a powerful way to assist your team to work towards a common goal. So what you do is, it's not time consuming. It'll only take you about 20 minutes to do. So it's not a big deal. And you can tack this on to one of your normal meetings. And I think that's a great idea. So what you do, and you don't have to pre-warn people. I mean, you can just turn up at the meeting and pretty much ask your team, a bunch of questions. So what questions are you going to ask? Well, let's have a look. So the questions that you can ask are, there are 4 key questions to ask in the team values charter. And what you do is you ask people to write down the answers to these questions as you go. Now, why do you want them to write it down? Well, because they've got they can remember what they said, and it also helps them to think it through. So if those of that might want to put it on their iPad, no problem, or the old-fashioned way with pen and paper, it doesn't matter. The idea is that they write down the answers to these 4 questions. I would also suggest to you that you need to do this, and I'd suggest you do it before the meeting so that you can actually have answers to these questions as well. So question 1 is, what is one value that's important to you when working in groups or teams? Now, so people write down a value. Now, I've done this in plenty of places. You won't have a problem. People will be able to write down something. So if I was sitting in your team and you asked me that question, I might say respect. So that's my value. Working in groups or teams, respect is extremely important to me. The second question that you're going to ask me at this point is, you're going to say, what is your definition of that value? Because of course, respect can mean different things to different people, can't it? So I might say to you, if you ask me, or I might write down the answer, respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they do not agree with their point of view. So that's my answer. So I write that down. And so I've got a very clear definition of what I mean by respect. And, you then move on to question 3. So you just got to give time, obviously, for people to write these responses down. And the third question that you ask is, why is that value important to you? Now, this is important because if you ask people why that value is important to you, it gives you some insight into, what people think are important when they're working in groups and teams. So if you ask me, I might say, I like to feel that I'm respected and my opinions are valued when I'm working with others. That's my why. Why do I feel that that's important? Because I want to be respected. So I write that down. And then question 4, the last question there is, what behaviors would be consistent with that value? Now, if I was answering that question, I might say, well, if people don't interrupt me when I'm speaking, I'll see that as a sign of respect, even when they disagree with me. So I write that down. Now, after everyone's finished, and it probably will take about, I don't know, from experience, about 10 minutes for people to finish writing answers for those 4 questions. Once you've done that, the next step is that you then read out your answers. So you'll say to people, I'll kick off. My number 1 value is respect. By respect, I think blah, blah, blah. I believe it's important for this reason, and here are some values, or sorry, here are some behaviors that would be consistent with that. Now, the number 4 is important because that's where the rubber meets the road. That is the actual behavior that manifests itself either consistent or inconsistent with the value. So once I've done my bit, I'll then go round the table and I'll make sure that every single, no, this is not some sort of opt-in or opt-out. Everybody is engaged in this conversation. So I will go round the table and I'll make sure that everybody has a chance to address those 4 questions. What I will do at the end is give other people an opportunity to ask questions about that person and their presentation of their value. So in other words, we try and turn it into a conversation. You'll be amazed at how well this works. You really will. Don't think it's just some flippant exercise. It works extremely well. Now, once you've heard everybody, you now have all of the content that you need to create what we call a team values charter. So basically, if you've got 5 people in your team, including yourself, and you've got 5 values, then you've got 5 values on the charter. You'll probably find very likely that there'll be some people in your team who have very similar values, and that's great, actually, because then you can you can, obviously they're thinking alike, but then you can actually reduce the number of values on the charter, and you can ask those 2 people, if there's 2, to get together to sort out how they might express that value on the charter. So your values come from that first question. Now, the other part that goes on the charter is not 3 and 4. Don't worry about 3 and 4 at this stage. What goes on the charter is question 2, that is the definition. So what is the definition of that? So that goes on the charter. So what the charter simply is say 5 values and 5 statements relating to each value. And that's it. Now you might say, oh yes, but there's already a plaque on the wall or whatever. But listen, the big difference here is that you have asked people for their opinion. And people don't argue with their own data. They are going to be thrilled that they will embrace your team values charter. Remember, you might say, well, how does this relate to our corporate values? Well, there is no relationship. The corporate values are the corporate values. These values that you've unearthed through this exercise is really the values relating to how people will be treated in a team, in your team specifically. So the idea is that people will honor those values when working in a team. Now, that's a great way of using the visioning statement, because let's say a piece of work has been done in your team and you're not happy with it at all. Now, that work could be interpersonal, where they're working with someone else, or it could be, as I say, a report or whatever it might be. And then you actually pull that person aside and you say to that person, you might say to them, how consistent do you think the work you've done here is in relation to our team values charter? In other words, get them to assess the work that they've done against the charter that you've created. So it's a powerful way, because obviously you can tell people what's good and bad and right and wrong and all the rest of it. But this gives you another string to your bow. So it gets people to start to think a little bit around how people want to be treated in a team. So you can be the custodian of that team values charter in keeping people honest to it. Now, when you know this is really working, and I've seen it happen, is when you get team members who pull each other up for violations in the team values charter. When that happens, this is working very, very well, because when people pull people up, then they're taking complete ownership of that team values charter, and that's a good thing. Now, you might say, well, what happens when someone leaves the team? Well, I actually believe that the values should remain on the charter to honour that person and their contribution to the team. However, if someone new comes into the team, then I'd be inclined to add to the charter by asking them to contribute one value, one definition, and then of course you can also ask them why it's important and what behaviours would demonstrate that value. It's a brilliant exercise, strongly recommended. So any questions at this point, folks, before we sort of wrap up? Alec?
Yeah, Tim, I was just a bit curious to know what can be done, or if you're faced with the situation that that someone doesn't agree with the purpose or the why of a task. I fully agree and can appreciate that. It's useful to understand the purpose of doing a task. And I probably don't see too much issue if someone objects to the what or the how is to be done, but because there may be a better way of doing it, and what they propose might be a better way of achieving it. But if they fundamentally agree with the purpose, how to approach that situation?
Yeah. Well, I think the way I tackle that is to think about the consequences of not even having this conversation, so that you don't even realise that there's a disagreement. So imagine that would be enormously frustrating. In other words, you wouldn't have any clue why the person's not doing the work that they're supposed to do. And so in other words, it's actually more constructive to find out that they don't agree than to actually not have the conversation. That's the first thing, because then you can understand at least where people are coming from. Then the conversation turns to, I'm sure you're thinking of an incident, and you don't need to tell us what that is unless you want to, but then the conversation ought to turn to, what is it about the purpose of this that's obviously annoying you, or you don't agree with, or whatever. The conversation then turns to that. Now, if it's one of those things that just has to be done, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with the purpose, then I'm afraid you just have to say that, well, look, it is what it is. Whether we agree or disagree, it has to be done. I can appreciate the fact that you don't agree with the purpose of it, but frankly, our hands are tied. It has to be done. So it's one of those sorts of things. You just have to tell people to get on with it. But I think having a conversation with people around the purpose at a deeper level sometimes will be insightful, because maybe they don't quite get it. Maybe the purpose isn't fully understood. Maybe they're in the wrong job. Maybe it's something other than the purpose. Maybe it was something that maybe somebody else had put out there, and that they philosophically disagree with that person on a whole range of things. There's so many complicated possibilities around that. But at the end of the day, if you're in a business, if you can link that purpose to customer satisfaction or client, whatever that is, it's very hard to argue against that, really. And I think that people, I don't know if you can share any more about that might be helpful, or.
No, it's not a particular incident that I'm thinking of. I was just
Yeah.
thinking
Oh,
about
right. Just
your
generally.
example
Yeah. Yeah.
about
Yeah.
cleaning the shop floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if someone was to have the opinion of, well, I don't think that's going to have an impact
Oh, I
on the
see.
potential client, yeah, then how to address that.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
agree with you. I think having the conversation,
yeah.
whether they agree or not, is still going to be a useful thing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you can just agree to disagree with the person, having explained to them that it'll create a good impression, having a clean sort of production area. If they think it won't make a hell of a difference in terms of whether they change there or not, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree. And then I might say to them, well, you just have to accept that that's my rationale for asking you to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I don't want to take the risk that it won't make any difference. I might say that. I don't want to take that risk. So that's why I'm asking you to do this.
Yeah.
So I think that's the way I might tackle that. But I think the point is you don't get defensive about it and you just sort of talk to them about why they have the view that they have that view. Yeah, it may not make any difference about whether they get the job, but it may certainly make a difference about whether they don't. You know what I mean? So it's a sort of I've seen people see a sort of a sloppy production area. It just might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I don't know for sure whether it make any difference either, but at least I'm giving that person the rationale as to why. I'm showing some dignity to them by giving them a definition of something, giving them a reason why, doing something that's quite mundane late at night. So I'm not making excuses, but that is the reason I'm asking you to do it. So yeah, so you just have the conversation, Alex, and just hope that you can meet at the right read at the meet sort of somewhere in the middle or whatever.
Another question:
Mm.
is there any theory in the benefits of explaining the purpose before the what and the how, or first explaining the what and the how and then follow up with the purpose? Is the sequence and the order of doing that? Is there a better way?
Yeah, it's a good
Better than the
question.
other?
I'm not sure. I think obviously what Simon Sinek's talking about is he's saying it's the be all and end all. He's arguing that people, when they come to the workplace, normally have a certain skill set and know how to go about what they're doing. Certainly they need a bit of coaching and guidance, and that's true enough. And then he argues that if you're looking at getting that little extra discretionary effort from people, the missing link is not so much a better, faster, and easy way of doing it. The link is often the purpose, the rationale, the why. I think it's interesting that in not-for-profits, I mean, in some places it's easier. I mean, if you and I were working in a not-for-profit and it happened to be like looking after homeless youth or something, that was the thing. I think it'd be a lot easier managing in those circumstances because the purpose is very compelling. It's there's a bit of emotional attachment to it. It's a little easier to articulate. But even in those circumstances, you're still going to have people that'll get bogged down in the forest and forget about the big picture of why they're doing what they're doing, which is obviously to look after young people who are homeless on the street. Yeah, and reminding people that that's actually what we're there for, rather than whinging about who should do what or whatever. Or so I think some businesses have got an advantage there, and some don't. As in, it's a bit hard sometimes. Say, for example, if you're working in a very regulatory environment, say in a public sector agency or something where it's not clear who the end users are of the services that you're putting together, it's going to be a little harder to convince people about the purpose of what they're doing than it would be. So if someone's working on policy positions, then I could probably, if I was in that position, I might say to the person, look, you realise that what you're doing here is shaping a better world. And, it may not make a huge difference, but it might make a little bit of a difference. So the work that we do here is important because some people may listen to this and governments are here to listen to policy, and that's what we're here for. So you can talk like that. in those sort of circumstances that might be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So any other questions from anybody else at this point before we wrap up? So, you know, your homework, I think, look, have a crack at this team values charter. You'd be absolutely staggered at how incredibly effective it is. I know you're probably confusing it with the plaque on the wall, but just think about this for a minute. The big difference between the plaque on the wall and what I'm asking you to do is that what I'm asking you to do, you're actually collecting, you're consulting with your team to come up with that charter, that set of values, whereas the plaque on the wall was probably put together, you know, by the senior team at most. So of course people look at it and they say, well, I agree with that, I agree with respect, I agree with this, I agree with that, but they don't have any emotional attachment to it because it didn't have anything to do with it. And so that's why people get very cynical about these things. But if you try this in your own team, the huge psychological difference is the fact that you are actually asking people to invest something that they believe in into this charter. And it makes a massive difference and makes your job easier to lead people to and have those conversations around, you know, values and how the team should lead. So folks, we might finish there if there's nothing else. Thanks everyone. I hope you found that useful, and look, you know, take out of it what you will. The next time we meet is we're meeting in 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about the encouraging conversation. So Alex, just while you're there, if I could just check with you, when I put this on full screen, can I just check with you? I'll just put this on full screen. What do you see? Is it full screen on your screen?
No, right now I'm seeing your notes as well. End of slideshow on the right-hand side.
I thought that, I was afraid that was the case. That's why I did it the way I did it. And yeah, I've got to work out, there's a little adjustment somewhere here that I haven't quite worked out what to do for the new computer. So thank you. That's why I didn't put it on full screen.
No problems. There was no derogative comments in the notes, so
yeah, I was
you're
okay.
Think,
I was trying to remember what I wrote. Anyway, have a good weekend, everyone. Catch you in 2 weeks, and we'll look at the encouraging conversation in 2 weeks. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye.
Bye all.